Okay. Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming to our Making a School List event. We are really excited you're here. My name is Sarah. I'm a senior, one of the peer mentors here. I'm a QSS major on the pre-med track.
I'm Sydney, junior, also one of the peer mentors, and I'm human health and art pre-med.
I'm Krishna. I'm a senior and through human bio and Middle Eastern and South Asian studies on the pre-med track.
My name is Coco. I'm a junior. I'm MEB in bio and BPA.
Cool.
First things first. All right, this is a little bit of a true false sort of thing, but there's sources like US, World, News and stuff like that with rankings. You should not use these, basically, right? One, US News, I don't know what they did, but they're not even ranked anymore. It's like these category things or tiers or something like that. So if you're actually looking for a ranking, you're not even really getting one. And then two, yes, like while it would be like it makes sense to want to go to, you know, a high ranked med school or the highest ranked med school possible. There's so many other factors that go in. And really the difference between like, I don't know, the 15th best med school and the 25th is not that great, right? They're fundamentally getting something that's pretty similar. So don't worry too much about rankings.
Okay. So where to start? We recommend that everyone applying to med school in particular starts with the MSAR. Do you guys know what that is? Are you familiar with that at all? Yeah, some people. So it's the Medical School Admissions Requirement Guide. It is put out by the AAMC, like the governing body of medical school applications. It's basically just an online database. It has pretty extensive information about all MD schools in the US and I think in it includes things like statistics of their students. You can read these yourself, but mission statements, requirements, and we'll talk a little bit more about like what to look for in MSAR, but we recommend that you start by looking at MSAR. The MSAR equivalent for DO schools is called Choose DO, and it is put out by the AACOM. So if that's something you're interested in, it's kind of the same thing.
And then, so this is a QR code that you guys can scan to access the MSAR guide. You do have to pay a small subscription fee. So for a 1 year subscription, it's 28, and for 2 years, it's 36. Your AAMC login will also give you access into the website. So yeah, you can go and scan that QR code. And then so once you're logged in and everything, this is what your screen will look like. So it alphabetizes all of the med schools, and it shows all of the stats and everything that we'll get into, and you can do some filters. But yeah, this is what your home screen would look like.
Okay, so kind of our goal for today is just to give you some things to think about while you're building your school list. These are 5 main things that we are going to talk about: school mission, environment and cost, curriculum, fit, and admissions requirements. So this isn't to say any of this information should like totally define your school list, but sometimes when you're starting to build a school list, it's like, I don't even know what to think of or what to consider when I'm trying to choose a medical school. So hopefully this will help a little bit in that regard. And if you have questions during any of this, please feel free to ask.
All right, so first we'll go into the missions of medical schools. And so I think when you're doing a ton of applications over the summer or something like that, like they can sound a little bit redundant, but there's key differences and details in each of them that are really important to keep in mind. All right, so here's a couple of mission statements. We don't have to read every single one of them out, but some sort of things that might stand out are: 1, advancing medical knowledge. So a lot of medical schools are very dedicated to research, right? They're academic institutions, very interested in that sort of vein. Over here on the left, you see that there's a huge sort of emphasis on the development of dedicated clinicians and all these other sorts of allied health professionals and researchers. And then also sort of an impact on community health. In the middle, again, you're seeing something a little bit similar, maybe with different wording or slightly different priorities. And finally, all the way on the right, you're seeing it sort of end off with a really big emphasis on outstanding patient-centered care. So again, lots of similarities, but a little bit of unique sort of differences. And then if you press again, you'll see that, you know, these are all different schools in different parts of the country that are going to have their own sorts of minor priorities and things like that. So as an example, just to go into this, so in Chicago, for example, some like major med schools that stand out are Northwestern, U Chicago, and Rush. So U Chicago, like all these schools are great schools, right? They're going to be focused a lot on research, things like that. But the University of Chicago, for example, is located in Chicago's South Side and therefore is really dedicated to sort of serving that community, like a very underprivileged community, right? Whereas Rush Medical School, for example, is very service oriented. So generally, like people who apply there have a ton of community service hours, a ton of community service experiences. And so while like, again, you're going to see a lot of overlap in terms of these schools looking for service oriented, community oriented people, they all have slightly different like institutional priorities that, you know, are important to keep in mind when you're selecting and putting them on your school list, but also especially when you're like writing your application for them, right? Tailoring your application or your essays to that school.
Another thing to keep in mind there, the spilling off of that is there are, I think like 4 or 5 Jesuit schools in the country. And those typically have a pretty big emphasis on service. And typically I feel like those schools are pretty selective for mission fit. So they're not going to care as much about having a really high MCAT score or something like that. They're going to care a lot more about the way that you're living out their mission fit, whether it's like service to those around you or anything along those lines. Just something to keep in mind.
An example that a lot of you might have thought to is Georgetown, right? Like a very Jesuit mission focused. And then a ton of medical schools are also sort of, as we mentioned earlier, really focused on research. So I think, you know, that extends to a lot of schools. I think particularly like T20 schools. So Stanford, for example, you're going to be super research oriented. Harvard, extremely research oriented. Emory, also quite a research oriented school, maybe not as super research heavy as like Stanford or something like that, but still a lot of the schools that you all are probably going to be applying to are quite research focused. But that definitely varies, right, in terms of extent. I think the reason we pointed out Stanford is just because it is very research focused. And as you can see here, it has what, like more than a third starting med school plan to conduct research. That number is probably even higher, right? Like this article was written in 2020. So you're seeing a big research focus. Again, that varies at schools.
Want to talk about environment and the cost. So the environment is very important. You probably consider that when you go to Emory yourself. But whenever you're in med school, you consider like what type of support system is going to be around you, probably home close, what like rural, urban, stuff like that. And also for future career opportunities, a lot of times the pipeline from where your school is to a close by hospital can exist in the same vicinity. So that's also a factor. But based off of your values for sure. Like this. So this slide compares NCG and TOSU. And we're trying to show the bias of in-state bias. You've probably heard this many times, but they love their in-state students because the one, it's like the taxpayers are paying to have future positions have on them one day. And notably NCG, out of 580 total interviewed, 45 came from in-state, and that's 94%. So very strong bias. And we want a little bit to contrast TOSU, 250 out of 630, not that much. So this is just to show that different schools in-state show different amounts of bias, but they do still show bias for their in-state applicants. Yeah. And then this one is just comparing your class sizes. Thomas Jefferson, first year class size of 272 versus Kaiser of just 50. But there are pros and cons to both a large class size and a small class size. A large class size, you have 271 people to network with and to learn from. People coming from different walks of life, different research and clinical experiences to learn from during your rotations as well. And also like after graduation, your doctor network is that big as well, plus more. Versus like in a small class size, 50 people, it's a little more personal for sure in terms of like the faculty and the student engagement. However, there's probably going to be a little less amount of resources. There's going to be less competition, which is an advantage, but there's also less people to learn from around you and pick up experiences and advice from, in contrast to the really big class size. Yeah, and then this one is just to show the importance of the environment around you. Emory is a very good example. Off the top of our head, it's UH, EDH, all the Emory University hospitals, St. Joseph, Midtown, everywhere, Grady, in the VA, and children's as well, of course. So such a very small, like within proximity of each other, you have all these to go to, like if you go to Emory or anywhere nearby. And these are, students have done this so many times in the past, it's very easy, it's already set up for you. Versus like if you go to like a med school in a more rural setting where you may face a little more challenges with getting the rotations up and also the networkings and stuff like that. And also, Krishna touched on this, but the population around you, is it more underserved? Like what is the population around you and what kind of demographic do you want to also include during your rotation years? So stuff to consider.
Yeah, building off of that, just one more example of like a medical school affiliated hospital, like maybe you'd want to consider is there are some schools, like for example, I know some schools that are located in like Arizona, they have like a very large Spanish speaking patient population. Like, is that something that you would maybe want to engage with? Like, then that might be a good school for you. Or other schools, like maybe they're a little bit more rural, you're not gonna get that like type of level 1 trauma situation, which is totally fine if that's what you want. If you are someone that wants to see like those kind of cases, then maybe somewhere in like a bigger city would be a better fit. Moving on to cost, we all know that graduate school, medical school in particular is really expensive. But just to look at, are there opportunities for merit scholarships? Are there ones that align well with you? For example, some schools will have scholarships that are geared toward students that contributed specifically to their area. Like, did you contribute or have you served populations of this city? Or maybe they're service oriented and you have a lot of service, then maybe you have a better chance of getting some sort of merit scholarship at a school that aligns with that mission. Public and private schools, another thing you can consider when you're looking at cost, and in-state schools are generally, specifically if they're public, are gonna be a lot cheaper than a private school. Just like to give you reference, my home state of Minnesota, the average cost per year is around 55 to 60,000 without any sort of aid. Whereas a private institution is around 95 to 105 a year. And those numbers like kind of make my head spin a lot, and they probably do the same to you, but there are a lot of ways to get assistance, whether it's through the school or federally, but just something to keep in mind that your in-state school is usually going to be a cheaper option. Okay, moving on. This is similar, but when you're making your school list, it's also important to keep in mind that applying to medical school is not free. It's actually quite expensive. It's typically, like you probably know this at this point, but like the MCAT and the CASPER exam, but the primary applications is $170 flat fee of $40 for each additional school you want to apply to. But you also need to keep in mind that for every school you apply to, they also have a secondary application, and those are usually around $100 for each school. In total, I applied to 30 schools, I think, and it was around in total like $5,000. And so just something to keep in mind, there are fee assistance programs that will like subsidize your cost to apply to a certain number of schools if that's something that you qualify for, but just something to keep in mind. Also, you can kind of disregard this interview thing. Interviews are pretty much all virtual at this point. Okay, moving on to curriculum. So there's a lot of information on MSAR and on the school website when you look into curriculum. But here are just a few things that you can look at. Because when I first was looking at this, I was like, I don't even know what to look at when I'm considering curriculum. First, it's pretty basic, but are they a pass-fail school? Most schools I feel like are pass-fail at this point, but yeah, but there are a few that are not. So just something to keep in mind. Generally, students I feel like at pass-fail schools like to talk about like the collaborative nature. It's not competitive in any way because it is pass-fail. If you are not familiar with like the general structure of medical school, there's usually a preclinical like classroom phase where you're learning in a classroom for usually like 1.5 to 2 years, and that differs by the school. So one thing to look into is the length of that preclinical education. Is it 1.5 years, which maybe gives you a little bit more time to explore different electives and like explore different specialties? Or is it 2 years, which maybe the pro of that would be that your preclinical education might be a little bit more stretched out, make it a little bit more manageable. Or maybe you're even learning more in depth, might have to study less for your board exams or whatever it is, but that's just something to keep in mind. Some schools have research years included in the curriculum if that's something you'd like. teaching style and if people attend class. I honestly did no idea that a lot of schools, people do not really attend class in person. So that's something you can look into too. If you want to look into match lists from previous years, you can do that. Just to see if any specialties you're interested in, how people are matching from that school. But keep in mind that a lot of times people do change their mind on specialty when they get to school. So I wouldn't weigh that too heavily. Okay, oh, this is me again. Okay, fit. So this is a general recommendation. You can take this with a grain of salt, depending on what your goals are. This is kind of what PHA recommends. This is also what I did, but your target schools should occupy 60 to 90% of your list. Your reach schools should be 10 to 40%, depending on how many you apply to. I think a general guideline I would suggest would be like if you apply to 30, which we generally recommend applying to 25 to 30. If you apply to 30, I would say maybe try to pick like 5 that are like reaches, like maybe it's not the perfect fit or you're not a perfect mission fit. Maybe the statistics are a little higher than what you have. And then I would pick kind of 15 in that range where you're like right around that. And then maybe 10 that you feel qualified for, feel like you have a pretty good shot at. That would be my recommendation. Obviously people kind of do different things in that regard, but a recommendation. Okay, another thing to look on an MSAR is the admission requirements of the school. Some schools have like very specific admissions requirements. Like for example, some schools will require a specific letter from a person. And if you don't have a relationship established with that person, and it'd be very difficult for you to get a letter from someone in that position, maybe that's not a school that would be great to apply to. I wouldn't say that like you necessarily have to like take that off your list entirely, but just something to keep in mind. Another thing to keep in mind is if they require situational judgment exams, if you're planning on taking that, and we're actually gonna have an event on situational judgment exams in a few months, but those are like non-academic skills, I guess, that are assessed in exams like Preview and Casper. And then what kind of prerequisite courses? There are a few schools that require specific courses like genetics, cell bio. I don't know if you've seen any other ones, but those are 2 that I've seen before. And so if you have not taken those and you have no plans on taking them, then maybe that's also not a school that we want to keep in the list. Yeah.
How many, around, what percentage of schools do you think the situational does?
It's not a very high amount, in my opinion. It's like, I had to put a percent on it, like 10 or less. Like, I don't think it's a
I
lot.
was gonna say like 15, 20. I think it's gaining
Yeah.
popularity though. So like, I feel like each year there are more schools that are like trying it.
Yeah, so there's a test called Casper, which is a lot older. And I think it's not too many schools that use that, but AAMC, like the official company, recently came out with Preview.
Yep.
And so I think that's slowly being adopted more and more, but out of all my schools, I applied to more than 30 and maybe about 5 to 6 asked for Casper Preview. So yeah, like 15-ish%.
Not that hard of an exam, right?
It's not like,
No.
I would say studying for it took like a few days. Like it's not.
I wouldn't study for
Yeah.
it for more than like a week.
Yeah, it's not
Sounds good.
intense.
Yeah,
I won't worry.
but honestly, if you aren't sure what schools you want to apply to, I would just like take the exam and just have it.
Yeah,
It's
just
not
take the exams
that-
just in case. They're not
yeah,
that bad.
just take it.
Sounds good.
Okay, admission statistics, just looking at, like how many people they're interviewing, how many they're referring, matriculating, how many applications they receive. There is this term that you might hear like thrown around called low yield schools. Generally, they say that low yield schools are schools that receive like over 10,000 applications, which is a lot considering that most schools have like under 200 people in their first year class. So some people say like, don't mind applying or don't bother applying to low yield schools. I wouldn't say that because like, obviously people do get into those schools, but just something to keep in mind, like if every school you're applying to is receiving like this 13,000 applications, I think maybe you should try to do some maybe that are a little bit on the lower end, maybe a little bit higher yield in that regard, but doesn't mean not to apply, just something to be mindful of.
And then there's also a feature on the MSAR website of demographics. So the types are your race and ethnicity, states represented, medically underserved and disadvantaged groups, and different gender identities for the people that were that enrolled in that year or admitted. And so this is really a good tool because it can help you make an informed decision in regards of do you see yourself in this type of school, as well as tailoring your applications. So if you're at a school, like for instance, at a AUC, and there's mostly California people, and you see very few people from other states, it's just something that you have to think about a bit more. But yeah, it's just thinking about the demographics of your classmates and type of people that you want to be around in your mission and personal statement.
Doesn't matter.
Okay, so these are just a list of resources. If you guys want to snap a picture, you can, but
Some of these are not for med, PA is for PA, like PAEA is for PA school, I believe, and then PT is for PT school. So if you're interested in med school, maybe not. These are just some more upcoming events we're having. Since you guys are here, I'm assuming that you guys are probably preparing to apply this year. So these are some events that we think might be helpful to you. Dr. Wallenstein, the physician advisor at PHA, is having demystifying the personal statement sessions. I believe they're in 2 weeks.
yeah, 2 weeks.
And then there's personal statement editing workshop.
Yeah, those will be at the beginning of April, and if you can, I would definitely recommend going to those and having like at least a working draft of your personal statement, because we have actual Emory Med students come in. And usually I would say like some of the best advice you're gonna get is from med students because they just recently went through it. And also if they're at Emory Med, it was evidently successful. So definitely come to those, ideally with the working draft. And those are like the 5th and 6th or 4th and 5th, sometime in April, but that'll be on Instagram, everything.
And then we're having a situational judgment exam, like we said, we're gonna talk about Casper and preview, kind of how to prepare, what those look like, just tips we have for that. And then finally, at the end of April, we're gonna have like an AMCAS walkthrough where we go through kind of how to navigate that. And then also, there's 6 or 7 peer mentors this year that applied this past cycle. So we're gonna kind of put our heads together and come up with a list of things I wish I knew before applying to share with everyone. If you guys think that'd be helpful, we'd love to see you there. Okay, that is it for our presentation. If you guys have any questions, we are happy to answer.
For the PHA events, will that come up later on in the website? Like to register for SVP or
Or,
the events you were talking about?
Other events, yeah, whenever Cinder posted.
yeah, they'll be put on Instagram and they'll be on the website, they'll be on the blog. So yeah. Any other questions?
For like the mission statement and like how to choose if your med school is like serving a certain population or it's more service oriented, like how do you go about that? How do you understand what the med school is tailored towards?
So I think a few different things. One sort of thing you can look into, and it's hard sometimes to parse through the stats, but if you look on the MSAR website, it'll show you the experiences of the incoming class. And so it'll show you that, yeah. So it's something sort of similar to this in terms of like the demographics, but it will say like community service, research, military service, things like that. And it'll be for some schools, you'll see that like 98% of the incoming class did research, right? Whereas for another school, it might be like 50 or something like that. So you can start to pick up like what the school is looking for in terms of an applicant. And then also, if you just do like research on the website, you'll see like what they seem to prioritize. So it'll say like very explicitly, like if you look at UChicago's website, like I remember looking at it, like it'll very explicitly say like located in Chicago's South Side, like we aim to serve our community, something like that. And then like if you look at Stanford's website, like it'll say like we aim for innovation, things like this, right? So it should be pretty clear from the websites what they're looking for. That being said, a lot of it is the same thing, right? They're all medical schools. They're all going to look for, like we said, people who want to serve their communities in some way. Probably, honestly, a good chunk of med schools want to look for some type of research. And then, you know, obviously clinical experiences, things like that. There's a ton of overlap. And the differences really in the grand scheme of things are like minor tweaks here and there.
I also think that when you first start reading mission statements, it's like they all kind of sound the same, but once you read like 20 of them, you will start to pick up on like, okay, this idea of service is really emphasized in this one, this idea of research or like innovative knowledge is really emphasized in another one, so you will definitely start to pick up on them once you read enough of them.
Mhm.
It's like always.
Yeah. Any other questions?
For like your in-state schools, like I'm from Florida, so obviously there's like a bunch of schools there that like for students, so like when you're looking at those mission statements, what should you really be looking for? If you know that you're gonna apply to them just because they're your in-state schools, then how do you really like, if it doesn't necessarily 100% match, how do you like tweak it a little bit?
I would honestly say apply anyway.
Okay.
So this mission statement thing is, I think, talking about, okay, if I'm choosing between like school A in one state and school B in another, then sure. But like, I think a bottom line for literally everyone who's applying as like a US applicant should be applied to literally every single state school. And then after that, like, okay, then start
Then
looking
start
into,
looking at the-
and then
okay.
all these other fine points.
Okay.
Like, I would say the mission, because really like the whole goal now, like college applications are a little bit different, but for med school, yes, you want to get into your dream school, but also you want to get into a school. The
Yes.
primary goal is to get into a school.
Yeah.
So cast a super wide net. Even if the mission doesn't really seem to match,
Okay.
you're still gonna get a good education there probably. So just cast a very wide net. This is for splitting a ton of hairs where it's like, okay, I'm gonna apply to a 30th med school. Do I do this one or this one? You know what I mean?
I think one other thing to keep in mind, can we go back to the slide with the in-state, or out-of-state thing? One thing to keep in mind when you're looking at if schools have in-state or out-of-state bias, I remember looking at something like OSU, Ohio State, and I was like, oh, they probably don't have that much in-state bias because they interview more people out of state than in-state. But like, that's not necessarily true, because if you look at the number of people, which is available on MSR, but if you look at the number of people that applied from out of state versus in-state, sometimes it will be like quadruple what applied in-state. So like, if you look at percentage wise, how many they're actually interviewing out of state, it would be like less than 1%, whereas in-state it might be like 10, 12%. So just like comparing the raw number of how many interviews they're giving in-state and out-of-state isn't always the best way to look at if the school has in-state bias. I don't know if that makes sense, but one thing I learned.
But almost every public school is going to have some in-state bias.
Yes.
Do you think it's worth applying to a public?
Outside of
Yeah.
your state?
Yes.
I would say yes, I would be selective. Like for example, Texas, UT, they had, I think, when I was looking at MSAR, they had like 3 or 4 students in the class before us that were from out of state. So like in that situation, you can kind of assume that those students probably had some sort of connection to the school, maybe like some sort of connection to the state of Texas. So even though maybe I would really like that school, I just did not think it was worth applying to. But there are schools that I think, like Ohio State, out of
Ohio
state,
State,
go ahead and apply.
Michigan.
Yeah,
UVA,
yeah.
and then in Florida, like UCF, are schools that people from out of state, it's like reasonable for them to apply to. Like I would apply to some like out of state public schools. Like there's a decent amount that are definitely worth it.
I just would take a look at what their
Yeah.
statistics are looking like before you do so. Like UF, they even say on their website, like I think they even said we don't consider students
Yeah.
that are not either have a connection to Florida or are from Florida, so like
Yeah.
not worth it. Just make sure you do your research, because like I said, applications are expensive, and if you don't do the research, like you might waste like
Just throwing,
$150 on a school that probably won't even read your whole application, so. Yeah.
What are the limits of what counts as a connection to the state?
usually they can be pretty tenuous. So I mixed up UCF and UF, costly mistake. I'm not from Florida. So so for the UF application, I had to like put in a connection, and I have like family there. So
That's like enough.
I would say that's like reasonable, but I mean, I didn't get an interview or anything, so maybe it wasn't. But I think that's usually reasonable to say. Like if maybe you've lived there in the past or something, and your current residency status is in another state, but if you were there in the past, if you have like close family, like an uncle or like cousin or something there, I think that's usually like a reasonable time.
Would you say, like, I know we're talking about like public schools, would you say that that you've noticed any in-state bias for private schools?
Some.
A slight amount, like, okay, Emory ostensibly, right? It's a private institution. It doesn't necessarily have like an in-state bias. And a ton of people from out of state come, but there's a very big focus on like Georgian health or like health in Georgia. And so you're going to see a lot of people who are from Georgia or people who have like come to Emory and like have some experience with Georgia, right? So it's not like a direct connection, but there's like slight things that definitely do sway the application panel or admissions panel.
Yeah, I would also say that for private schools that are more like service oriented, I feel like a general rule would be that they oftentimes have a little bit more bias for in-state people, just because if their emphasis is like serving our community, serving this city, then they probably would prefer a student that would stay in their state. Whereas I think a more like research focused institution probably isn't gonna care as much.
I think if you have like, if it's a service oriented school and obviously I didn't go to school in Florida, college, do you think it's worth talking about service that you did do within Florida, or do you think do you think it's helpful to mix service things, if that makes sense?
I think a mix is definitely worth, and also you can draw like parallels, right? In August, like I worked with this community in Atlanta, and I look forward to working with this community in like Tampa, Florida, or something like that. You know, yeah, you had it.
Do you think research heavy med school or like which factors about a med school can help you get matched a bit for residency? And like which factors do you think help you match at a good residency that you want? Or like,
I think so I wouldn't worry about that really when you're applying to med schools, because usually it tends to like work out in terms of that sort of stuff. But if you really do want to look at that, some like universities don't have like dedicated strong departments in certain areas, right? So say you want to, I don't know, match into dermatology or something, there's going to be some universities or like medical institutions, med school, stuff like that, where there isn't necessarily like a very robust dermatology research program or something like that. And so research matters a lot for like residency applications. So that's something to maybe keep in mind, but that's something for way later on. And then two, for a lot of those, tons of med students take these things called research years, where they literally just take a year off to grind research, right? Just because research has become so important for residency apps. So say you go to a university where there isn't a strong derm department, but you really want to match derm. Okay, take a research year at another university where there is a really strong one, get all your publications, whatever, and then you'll be good to go. So for now, just worry about the med school itself, because the residency stuff is a couple of years away.
I also think that like, I agree with that research has become increasingly important, but I also think that at the end of the day, like you need to tell your story. And like, if research is not something that you are
Sure.
interested in, and it's not something that you see yourself doing in the future, and like you feel really passionately about serving a certain community, then like you really investing your time into that will also go a long way. Like, I think it's at some point, we also have to like recognize, like, we need to fulfill ourselves and not just like what we want to look good for like another application or to like get to the next place, you know? So there's like a healthy balance there, I think, but.
Yeah.
I know you mentioned those factors we need to. But like, how you actually do it, you download the list of every medical school and then you kind of match your GPA.
Yeah, so what I can talk about kind of what I did, maybe you can do the
Yeah,
same, but
yeah.
I just like went through MSAR and I like scrolled through it and I started making a spreadsheet. I first added my in-state schools, which there's only one, so it didn't take very long. But then I just went through and I like wrote down the names of all the schools that I thought that I would like potentially be interested in. Then I started looking at like their statistics, and if I was like relatively close, you can also see on there like the range of like MCAT and like GPA. So like some schools are like pretty wide range, like their average could be like a 520, but they take people from like a 505 to like a 528. So like maybe if you're in that range, you could keep it on the list. If maybe you're like totally outside of a range, maybe delete that off your list. And so that's kind of how I like narrowed some down. And then at that point, I probably had like 45, and I just went through and I like did a little more research, like tried to figure out kind of what sets each school apart, whether it was like location or like mission or the curriculum, anything along those lines, and then I just kind of weeded it out from there. But when you're applying to like 25, 30 schools, like there are bound to be some schools on the list that you're like not that excited about, which is totally okay. But just trying to make sure that like it is somewhere that if you're gonna put the effort and money into applying, like you could potentially see yourself there.
Yeah, so sort of pretty similar way I went about going to make my school list. So I'm an Ohio resident and Ohio has like 8 med schools or something. It's a ton. So that already made up like what, like basically a third of my med school list. And then after that, I went through sort of same thing that Sarah did. I just wrote down like a bunch of med schools I wanted to go to, like that I thought sounded really cool, that I thought could be interesting. I think most people should probably at least consider applying to Emory, like being an Emory undergrad. It's not like there's a direct pipeline or anything there, but there's obviously something to be said about institutional affiliation. And then I sort of went through public schools around the country that were pretty like out of state friendly. So like UVA, like I mentioned, right? Or like Michigan, things like that. And then had like a big list, and then I sort of forced myself to cut down to 35. And then I just sort of went about it like that. Like, do I want to go to A school or B school more? Like, could I see myself at either one of these? Okay, I could see myself at A school more, so could I B? And then sort of just went along that route to limit myself. And as for limiting, I think there's a few different things there. One, you do want to cast a very wide net, because remember, the goal here is to get into A school, and then you can start to be picky about all this mission stuff, things like that. And then two, there's cost. So applying to med school is unfortunately really, really expensive. And the fee assistance program that AMCAS offers covers up to like 20 schools or something. But the Emory average, like even 2 years ago, was 25 schools. And now I'd be willing to bet that it's probably higher. And then finally, writing all these applications takes a ton of time. Like it is hard. It is unfortunately a lot of work. So you want to be sure that you're going to finish these applications. So that's why it's like, you don't want to, like, you need to find sort of a Goldilocks zone between applying to enough, but not applying to way too many. Yeah.
When do you think, like, obviously you write like timeline, you write like personal statement, pick your school list, and then like when do you start like pre-writing secondaries?
But
Or do you think it's worth pre-writing secondaries?
Okay, so I would say, all right, you're going to ideally finish submitting your like primary application, which means your personal statement, your work and activities, and then like demographic information, stuff like that. Transcripts are another big thing. By the end of May or like beginning of June, right? You want to get those in as early as possible. Then secondary applications don't generally start coming out until the very end of June. So you probably have like a month there. A few things I would recommend doing there. So in the first-ish part of June, you probably want to take your Casper and preview if you haven't already. That's usually a pretty golden time to take it.
Yes.
Sorry?
You take it from home.
Yeah, exactly. So that, and then I would honestly take like a week off. Like you've probably been working a ton, so take a week off. And then that leaves you with like 2 weeks probably-ish before secondary start coming out. That's when maybe start working on like coming up with ideas at least, or essays that you would do. And a good resource for that is something called admit.org, because they publish all the previous like secondary prompts for the schools you're interested in. So for example, I'm from Cleveland and I really wanted to get Case Western Reserve done early. So I looked at like the previous year's essays for that and started working on those. And then you can start to like cross apply those to other schools, right? Like a lot of them are going to tell us about like a tough ethical situation you have to deal with. Okay, I wrote that for this. I just have to adjust it a little bit here. So I think that might be a reasonable method to go about stuff.
Yeah, I would echo that, and I would say like the ideas part is like the most helpful thing you can do. Because like every school is gonna have a specific word count, specific character count, and it's gonna be different for every school. So like, even if I write an essay about like diversity for one school, I'm going to have to change it to do another school. So I think the most like valuable thing you can do in terms of pre-writing is to like just start listing ideas. Like I remember I had a spreadsheet and I like sorted each prompt by like the type of prompt. So like, okay, is this a prompt about like diversity? Is this a prompt about a time I failed? Like whatever it was, then I would start like listing experiences of like things I could talk about in each one. So then it was time for me to write it. I could just like start telling that story. But you do have some time until that happens, so.
What was the name of the site that showed previous secondary application questions?
Admit, like admit.org. It's also, so I know we said like, don't strictly look at like rankings and stuff like that, but Admit has its own like internal sort of ranking thing. And they also have really good information about like, oh, out-of-state acceptance rate, out-of-state interview rate, all this sort of useful statistics. So I think if you don't use US News, admit.org is like a very helpful resource. It's also newer, so
It is free.
yeah.
You guys mentioned the like, curriculum stuff, like I've heard some schools don't follow like the step. Curriculum. Like, is that something that we should like strongly consider or don't really worry about?
It is true, like there are some schools that I think the more common like way they talk about it are like, are your exams like in-house or are they put out by like the body that puts out the step exams? And it depends on the school. Honestly, I feel like no matter where you go, you'll be able to like figure out whether if it is in-house, then like it's written by the school, then I think that their curriculum should be preparing you well enough to do well in that exam, regardless if the questions are exactly in the format or not. People, I feel like at those schools also are like pretty accustomed to like finding outside resources to do that. So I don't know, I feel like you can kind of go both ways with it. I've also heard people like schools, I talked to a student at a school that was not super like regimented along with the step exams. And they were saying that their deans of curriculum are like, we're teaching you how to be a doctor, we're not teaching you how to pass this exam. So we might include things that are not included on the exam, but it's like still valuable for you to know. So I feel like there's pros and cons of both sides. I don't know if you should weigh it too heavily in your decision.
Yeah, that being said, I completely agree. Like I would not weigh it too heavily because like med schools receive very, very strict requirements for accreditation, meaning they have to teach you these certain things. And the thing with step 1 and 2 now is because step 1 went past bill like a few years ago, from my understanding, schools are still trying to like figure out how to adjust to that. Like it's all very much in flux right now. And it definitely will be by the time like we're all, or any of us who are applying to med school will be in med school. So don't like weigh it too heavily. And then there's always like prep programs, right? Like people have these textbooks and usually schools pay for those sorts of things. Like they want you to do good on step. So don't worry too much about it.
So I know one of the criteria is GPA. Does it GPA from one school look different than GPA from another school? Depending?
I think so. So one thing that they do is AMCAS will like recalculate your GPA. So I know there's some like schools where they have like A pluses, for example, and then that counts as like a 4.33. So those people have like really high GPAs compared to like Emory, where you can't get above a 4 in a class, right? But what happens is when you submit your transcript, like ideally again, sometime in May, AMCAS will like reproduce and recalculate your GPA to make it standardized. So that's one thing. Two, undergraduate institution that you went to unfortunately does matter a decent amount. So, or fortunately or unfortunately, yeah, fortunately for us, to be honest. But yeah, so like we're fine. Like going to Emory will be okay. And then at some schools, like they're gonna like put a ton of preference on like someone from like Harvard or something like that. It's just the way it is. So it's not all the same, but we're okay. Is the thing.
Also, like, say your GPA is like slightly lower than someone that like goes to a state school or something like that. You also have had a lot of other opportunities being at Emory that can also set you apart. You know, like there are really great faculty members, there are a lot of opportunities for research, like there's a lot of community outreach at Emory, and like being part of an institution like Emory helps set you apart in ways outside of your GPA as well, so.
And finally, just as like an anecdotal thing, I have a friend from home who's an engineering major, and obviously those courses are going to be pretty difficult, but he's doing quite well in his application cycle. So they definitely do look at like rigor and things like that. So, you know, if you're in like tough STEM coursework or something, or just in any sort of coursework in general, I think they'll be quite understanding. Like it's not like this hard cutoff, like you're,
Yeah.
done for.
I also think that stats matter less than people think they do, to be honest. Like I know people that have scored very, very highly on exams and like maybe aren't having the cycle that they want, whereas people maybe with lower stats are having like a great cycle. And I think that even going into it, I think that I thought stats mattered a lot, and like it does to some extent kind of to get your foot in the door, but after you get your foot in the door, like they don't really care. Even at like some interviews, they've told me like, doesn't really matter what stats you have, like now we just wanna know like who you are as a person. So I think like, yes, try to apply to schools that are kind of in your range, but at the same time, like, I don't think that stats are everything, and I think there are a lot more important factors than what you score in the MCAT or your GPA, and I think medical schools consider that.
If you're like applying to both MD and DO, like how do you go about deciding like how much MD versus how much DO, and like did you apply to DOs at all, and like what was that process like? How was it?
I did not apply to DO schools, however, I think generally when people do, they do kind of similarly where they cast a wide net. They might apply to DO schools that are in their state, DO schools that are in their region maybe, and then kind of apply to MD schools that you like think would be a good fit for you. I can't like speak specifically on like what you should do, like a breakdown, because I think a lot of it also depends on like how you feel your application fares, with the requirements or like the statistics and stuff for DO versus MD schools. But yeah, I guess that's like.
Yeah, I think I also did not apply to a mix, but if I were thinking about how to go about it, I would apply the same logic, right? Apply to all state schools. So in this case, we're thinking both DO and MD. And then look at that same sort of thought of, okay, do I see myself here? Do I want to go here? And just think about like that breakdown we told you about, right? So